Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeremy Frye. Thanks for coming out to Summit this year. Is everybody enjoying Summit so far? Obviously, it's almost over, but nice, nice. I love coming out to Seattle, so I learn a lot. Plus, I enjoy presenting as well, so I'm very excited and grateful to the Summit staff for selecting me. Today we're going to be talking about Power Apps and AI. It won't be really deep learning in the AI. It'll just be, we're not going to be really going over in-depth algorithms or anything. This is more just to provide you the information to be able to utilize Power Apps and connect to various places to do different things and build intelligent apps. As I mentioned, I work for RDX and Navisite. We're going through a rebranding here, so a lot of people know me from RDX, but you also probably know me from Navisite's name as well, coming here in the near future. I am one of the senior managers of professional services there. I've been there for almost 10 years and pretty much started my career there and have transitioned along with the industry from being a database administrator all the way up to a business intelligence developer, architect, and then now a manager. So doing some really cool things there. I'm also very active in the SQL community. I like to travel and speak at different SQL Saturdays. This is my fourth summit altogether, and this is my third year speaking. So what we'll talk about today is, I'm not sure if anybody else from a presentation standpoint has actually given a demo right from the very beginning. Usually you talk a few slides and then go into a demo. I'm actually going to show you an end-to-end solution right from the very beginning. The reason is because the whole point of this presentation is to really show the capabilities of Power Apps, and if I were to segment and break it up, it just makes it a little harder to follow and to understand. So once I give you the end-to-end solution, please don't leave because what we'll do is from there, I'll break it up and we'll actually do a deep dive in some of the language that is within Power Apps and how it's communicating with the other services that it's using. Again, we'll be diving into the functionality and the design, and we'll be incorporating, they just changed this on me, so that's why it's crossed out here. It was Microsoft Flow, and as of, I believe, Monday or Tuesday, they've changed it to Power Automate or Power Automation, since it works in conjunction with a lot of the Power platforms, so Power BI, drawing a blank right now, Power BI, Power Apps, obviously. Additionally, we'll be looking at cognitive services. So specifically, we'll be looking at a Bing entity search. Maybe not as cool as some of the vision cognitive services and APIs, speech recognition, different things like that, but you can definitely expand your application to do that. By show of hands, how many people in here currently use Power Apps? So 3 out of the room. So great, you'll get a chance to learn some different things about it. It's an awesome tool, and what we'll do is we'll dive into it here shortly. So the first thing people think about Power Apps is application, right? Usually from a historical standpoint, when you talk about applications, you're either on one side or the other, right? Earlier in my career, I was a DBA. Most of the time, I just worked with the backend database, administering it, developing code for it, writing stored procedures, tuning stored procedures, diving into maybe ETL and business intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes you're on the other side of it from an application developer. Very rarely do both of those scenarios collide, and usually when they do, it's an application developer who's trying to write code and they write very poor code, poorly performing code. So, but nowadays, we're into a millennium where applications are useful in every scenario. It's not just a application for a data entry program from a business standpoint. Now there are applications that not only run on computers, but that everyone uses a tablet or everyone uses a phone. Every single business almost has an app that they can run via a mobile device. And so Power Apps is kind of bridging that gap here and providing some capabilities to run in mobile devices and also coordinate with the backend database as well. So what is Power Apps? As I mentioned, it's application development solution. And when you think about historical application development, you think about if you, and I may date myself here, like Dreamweaver, but now you might have HTML, you might have Flash. I didn't come from that background. However, I'm familiar with it in just the day-to-day activities of being a DBA and working with developers and incorporating different code into applications. So now we've gotten more into like tools such as WordPress. So everyone has a website and most people can kind of build it from scratch in WordPress or use templates, etc. PowerApps is giving you kind of similar capabilities to be able to use expression languages and build a very intelligent app with little to no coding experience. So as I mentioned, it's accessible through the web and mobile devices, as well as the biggest benefit here that I see that's different from a lot of other applications is the connectivity to the database. So you can also control without writing a whole bunch of C# code or knowing .NET or Java, a lot of interaction with the database and control the code that's behind it. A gentleman here earlier asked about cost. Here's the cost for PowerApps. There's a link down below. I always cite all of the images that I use. So the presentation here, if you've downloaded it, I've made some updates to it. So actually this isn't, if you've downloaded the PDF from the site, this isn't the most recent one. I will get this. I was making changes up until about an hour or so ago. So you can either license PowerApps by user or per app. So it's typically less expensive if you only have a couple of developers who are building apps. But if you're trying to spread that multiple apps across multiple facets of your organization, then it's usually better to go with the scenario of the $40 a month, which allows you to have unlimited apps. So really, if we talk about some of the key differences here between the apps, it is just essentially that, as well the number of apps you can use without being charged extra. And then additionally, if you use common data services, is anyone in here familiar with common data services? Okay, cool. So with common data services, you're limited on size when you just use the $10 functionality. I think it's like 50 megabytes per app and 250 megabytes per app for the unlimited use, as well as 400 megabytes per user and 2 gigabytes per user. So there's a big significant difference there. It really depends on the organization that you work for and the scalability that you're trying to have with PowerApps. So before I get into my demo, I had to paint a use case. Imagine everyone here, I'm assuming, has potentially used Uber, or maybe you have Amazon accounts where you order different things on Amazon and you get them delivered. So with that being said, maybe you want to have a company, or you're one of the managers or owners of these companies, and you want to track your deliveries, or you want to track the different consultants or the different individuals who work for you who are out in the fields. Maybe you want to track where they're at different times. Maybe they need to report back. Maybe you need to make sure they're not going home and staying for an extensive period of time. Different capabilities and reasons. But what I decided to do for this use case is I wanted to track location services. As we all know, on your phone, you can turn on location services, and it's useful for everything. When you're walking, you can get notifications. You can get, when you're driving around, you can understand where you may be. You can use Google Maps, etc. So what I decided to do is I wanted to stretch the limit of PowerApps, and I wanted to see how flexible and how powerful it actually could be. So I wanted to duplicate sort of like a Google Maps type of an interface. So here's usually what your Google Maps looks like from your phone. There's also a desktop version as well. And you can type in a location, a destination, and you get route information. You can also do side query searches, which establish additional waypoints for you to, maybe veer off from your location and find a nearby restaurant, or if you're running out of gas, find gas, etc. So many people, might think, well, if we already have Google Apps, why would we use this in PowerApps? Well, the biggest difference here is the interaction with the database. If you think about it from a Google standpoint, can you control anything that's within the Google app itself? If you were to allow your drivers to use Google Maps, and I know Uber, for example, uses every driver that I've ever rode with in Uber or Lyft has used Google Maps to take you from whatever location they've picked you up to whatever location that they're actually dropping you off. Well, Uber behind the scenes, they also have tags of location events on their actual cars as well, so it tracks that. But my thought process would be, okay, well, what if I just wanted to do it from one app? So I tried to use PowerApps in order to track the location services of a potential use case. Now, you might also think, well, I don't need this for a business purpose to interact with the database. I only need it for my own personal use. Great, use Google Apps. I'm not saying you need to duplicate this effort of an application. This is really just to showcase the power of the actual platform. So let's actually get into it. Now, what I've done is I've actually deployed this to my phone, and I'll show you how you can access it from the phone. Okay, there we go, sorry. So from my app here, there's literally, I don't know if anyone can see it. Can everyone see it from the back? Okay. It may be, I can zoom in if it may be a little small. There's literally a PowerApps app that you can download from the Play Store. So if you go into the Play Store, now here's the biggest difference with something like Google Apps versus PowerApps. With Google Apps, it's embedded directly into the Play Store. With PowerApps, you have to download the Power App first, and then you sign in to your business account. So it's only for business use case. It does not give you an opportunity to be able to deploy it to the Play Store or the App Store for iPhones, et cetera, without using the Power Apps app. Hopefully, I know Microsoft is making extreme strides in Power Apps, so hopefully that might change here. So here's Power Apps. I already have it installed, but I at least wanted to show you what it looks like, from a download standpoint. So what we'll do here is I'll go ahead and open it. And here's a list of the applications that I have. My past demo one is here. So what it'll do is it'll also ask me, I have some custom data sources, which I'll dive into as well. And it also is prompting me to use my location services. So it's same as any other app when it comes to what it's allowed to connect to. It needs to ask your permission to do that. So as you can see here, I have a map at the top. I can select my aerial coverage. So what I can do is, before I do that, let me zoom in. So you can see that, I'm zoomed in here, and let me see if I can. So this shows me my current location, but then if I come out of that, I can actually select the different terrains that it gives you from a Google Maps standpoint. So I can show aerial coverage. So it actually gives me the aerial coverage like the map. And I can do with labels, so I could actually see street names and different metadata that's associated with that. I can zoom in and out, et cetera, right? I have the ability to see quite a view, same way that you would see from like a Google Maps. So again, I'll dive into the code of this a little later, but I at least wanted to show the full functionality. So from this standpoint, what I also have on this screen is I have the ability to type in a destination if I wanted to get route information of my current location to where I'm trying to go. Same way that you can find directions on Google Maps. So if I go in here and I type in Space Needle, and it's pretty smart. It's smart enough to figure out the address. Oh, it looks like there's a... All right, it's not finding it on that. So to continue on, and I'll come back to this, and there may be an issue because I'm getting an unknown error at the top. So I'll dive into the code. I may be able to fix this, but I have recorded a video at the end that actually shows this in live demo, walking around Seattle. So I've prepared for any kind of technical difficulties here. So additionally, let me just continue on with the rest of the information is I can choose to do walking directions or driving directions. I'm using what's called an icon on PowerApps. Now they have one for cars, but they did not have an icon for like a person walking. So I just threw any image there, and that's the guy that's to the right-hand side. But right now it's highlighted. I can on driving directions, but if I wanted to do walking directions, I could literally click on the guy there as well, and you can see it changes my colors to know what I'm selecting. I will also go over the logic within the expressions to do that as well. I have three more buttons. One is the show route, which will take me to a different screen and actually shows me my walking or my driving route that I can click on. And I also have where I'm calling cognitive services to do a Bing entity search based upon a query. And what I'm doing is I'm actually showing it from a standpoint of restaurants near me. Now that's just what will happen when I click the button. But if I wanted to have an input where I type in any kind of search as if I'm in Google to find anything on a map, it will work that way as well. It's just hard coded to find restaurants. So if I click show route, so I'm not sure what happened with the first map, but you can see here my map changed, and it actually took me to it took me to a different screen with a different map that actually shows me my driving directions. If I wanted to flip that and look at walking directions, I can click and it shows me a different route again for walking directions. So it's pretty intelligent, and I'll go over some of the logic that's behind that. What I'm not seeing is I do have a distance in miles and a travel time, which essentially will send a notification. So I wanted this app to be extremely smart if I were running a manager or an owner of a company that distributed deliveries or had delivery drivers or had surveyors in a field or consultants in different regions. I wanted to be able to have this smart enough if, for example, if I am working for Amazon and I have a driver who's out delivering, I wanted it to be able to send a notification to the actual customer that we can have in a database to say, your delivery is within 15 minutes of arriving. So that's one thing that you can't get from Google Maps, and that's why I wanted to expand on the functionality of PowerApps, because essentially PowerApps gives you more control over the backend database and what you're interfacing with. And I think now that I'm looking at this, I think my issue is it's not finding the coordinates of my current location, and it may be the building. So what I'll do is I've also built in some validation logic within this, and that's what the little wrench is on the right-hand side. So if I show that, it actually is showing me my coordinates. Let's try it one more time. I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, I will do restaurants near me and see if that will work, and then I'll go into the application, and that's not either. Okay. Let me actually go into the interface and see if I can get it to work there. It may be the app that I have published. So I had a couple more slides before I wanted to get into the actual logic. However, because my app is not working on the phone, I'm gonna see if it will actually pick up the coordinates here. So I apologize for that. So this is the interface. If I actually go back and let me come out of it. If I go to open, here's my recent file. I can browse for additional files if I have something So that's something there. Here's some other apps. I have different demos, etc. So I'll go ahead and reopen this just to make sure it validates everything correctly. So up here to the right, there's a play button that you can actually play it. So right now I'm in a design interface, and from the design interface standpoint, this is where you can, if I click on my drop down, for example, this has, the different values that I can supply down to my map, and that's how I was able to change what terrain I was actually looking at. I'll come back into this more specifically, but I want to see if I can actually get the demo to work from here. So it looks like this one may work because if I drill in, yeah. So this one is actually working. And if I change this to an aerial view, you can actually see here. And if you can't see, I'll zoom in. You can actually see here is the Space Needle. It's from an aerial view, a bird's eye view. So I'm not sure what's going on with the app. I can try that again later to show you how I actually got it to my phone, because you can log in. But right now, if I make a change, it won't propagate down to my mobile device. I actually have to publish it. So I can save it within my workspace of PowerApps, but it will not show up on my phone. So it may be something happened with that version from a corrupt standpoint, or it may be the location services on my phone not being updated correctly. So essentially what I can do is I can just hit publish here, which will publish any updates that I've saved in the PowerApps. So since I have Space Needle here, if I click on driving directions and click on show route, now I have my route here. If I switch it back over to walking directions, then I get my walking directions here, which changes my map. And you can also see that it's also propagating the distance in miles from my current location. So it's 1.8 miles from here, and it'll take me just about 9 minutes to get there. So if I also want to look at restaurants near me, I can click that, and that takes me to a new site. What that is now it's a gallery that actually shows me the restaurants that are close to me that are within the coordinates of my current position. If I go back to my previous screen and click restaurants near destination, what that will give me is that'll give me what's closer, restaurants that are closer to the Space Needle. Because this is all Seattle, it may not look like a difference unless we specifically look at individual restaurant names. So what I can do is I'll actually put in a different place here. So enter a new destination, and I will just type in Pittsburgh since that's where I'm from. And I will not do walking directions. Show route, and you can see how my map changed, and it shows me, a really long cross-country journey there. And it also shows me that my travel time and my distance is significantly greater than obviously going to the Space Needle from where I'm at. So if I do restaurants near destination now, you'll see that this is giving me Pittsburgh, restaurants. Sure, question?
That automatic pan zoom
Yes.
that you spoke of, was that built in, or was that something you had to
You mean what
enable?
this here, what I'm doing here?
No, sorry. When you jump back, how it was able to show the entirety of the United States?
Yes, it's built, so I had to develop that. So really quickly, it's probably
I've
easier to
worked
show
with
you,
zooming before, and
right?
Yeah.
So this is a Microsoft doc that tells you all the different types of maps that you can get. So there's all kind of maps here that give you specific waypoints, right? You can set your zoom and your focus in different areas. So I had to configure it, and I'll get into the code of that, but I had to configure that to be able to scale properly when I enter different waypoints. Any questions before I move forward? Yeah, sure, over here.
Coordinate, do you need an API from Bing?
Yes. So I'm going to get into that as well. But the question was, do you need a API key from Bing Maps in order to allow Bing Maps to render the map? You do, and I will show you that. So looking into the future here, obviously I come from as I mentioned earlier, I come from a DBA background. So I've always only worked on one side of the spectrum, which is databases. But then you also, have application developers who also work on one side of the spectrum. And as I mentioned, unless they were coding for databases to feed into their application. But now with Power Apps, we're bridging the gap of being able to not necessarily have an application development background and maybe not necessarily even have a database development background. But now we're allowed to bridge the gap here because we have application development lifecycle within Power Apps that also allows you to control the database, and then vice versa. You can control the tables and the database structures and the schema on the back end and how it feeds into Power Apps. With that together, we also have cognitive services in which, we're tying both the control of the database level, the application design and what it looks like to an end user, and then the capabilities of expanding the usability of that app by projecting out, artificial intelligence or having it make smart decisions on what you're trying to do. So many people might think, well, are robots taking over the world? Because there's all of these sessions about artificial intelligence and machine learning, et cetera. And while some people may think that, I like to think of it as efficiently standing up better business processes for your end users, maybe for customers, et cetera. Also looking at it from a usability standpoint, no longer is an application just a data entry application like most companies, maybe 15, 20, 30 years ago have. Now, like I mentioned, there's mobile apps to do different things, and they all have some sort of smart logic built into them to kind of take them beyond what their general purpose of use case is. So obviously some pros and cons of Power Apps. The pros are you can connect almost any data source. They're coming out with new data sources as fast as you can blink to connect to, and they're easily integratable. It's an easy expression language, which I'll get into, and there's integration with additional tools. So for example, I'll go into cognitive services. So that's reaching out again to another API. And in order to do that, which this might be a con to some if you don't have the experience behind it, is you have to create a custom data connector and actually parse the JSON behind the scenes of that. And I'll go into that as well. But it definitely gives you the flexibility, which is an extreme pro of using Power Apps. And then obviously you can use it for mobile apps, for desktops, for tablets. Some of the cons are the designs are not interchangeable. So if I start developing a mobile app in that design interface that I was showing, and I've built some complex logic within it as I'm doing with Google Maps or Bing Maps, what I'm not able to do is then switch that design surface into a desktop app that expands the entire screen. So it's not interchangeable. Once you start developing in one, you can't switch it to the other layout. I think depends on what your use case is, but I think if you have that flexibility, it would be a lot better, but I'm hoping that Microsoft makes some improvements there. Additionally, the logic can be pretty complicated. So in order, just to kind of specifically point out, the driving and walking icon that I had, which when you click on it, it changes the green and it grays the other one out, and vice versa. If I click on the walking directions, that will turn green and then it will gray out the driving directions. There's a little bit of a roundabout way to get that to work. So when you have a lot of different functionality in your apps, it can get pretty tedious and complicated to manage. And I have some techniques that I use to help manage that. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is that you have to have a work email. I can't sign up with Gmail and create Power Apps. So usually it's for business use case, not a general perspective of deploying out to an app store. I just mentioned that, sorry. So one app at a time just essentially is you can only run one app at a time because it's user-based unless you go with the unlimited app-based situation. So it can also get pretty clunky when you're starting to do a lot of manipulations and a lot of different things. I'll show you, I actually did a live video earlier to show this in a real demo in action as I was walking about Seattle. And the first time I did it, it actually didn't render the distances and the mileage correctly. But the second time I did it, it did. And I think a lot of it had to do with being in the inner city, and the building sometimes can interfere. Because even using Google Maps, I even tried it on Google Maps and it was kind of throwing me in different places. So it can be a little clunky, and I think that that can be a con as well of the application. But more or less for location services, not necessarily the application. Let's go into a little bit of the logic here. So I'll step through this design. Let me blow it up a little bit so you all can see it. So one of the things that helps me when I'm doing a lot of complex development in Power Apps is the naming conventions that I use for the different objects that are in my design. So for example, on the left-hand side, you have a tree view. You can change this view to different views. I like the tree view because I can expand and collapse. I have 5 different screens that are associated with this. And within the screens, there's different objects. So every single object that's on my screen, I've had to insert based upon the ribbons in the menu. So when I click insert up here, and let me zoom in if it's hard to see here. You know, I can add a new screen. I can do a label, a button, text, input, a gallery, a data table, a form. I can add media. I can do charts and graphs, icons. There's even some built-in AI functionality as well. Now, I didn't use this functionality, but I've built my own. So I'll actually show you how to basically behind the scenes, the templates that Microsoft used in the AI builder is what I've done custom. My rule of thumb is I like to name everything essential to what it is. So if it's an icon, I will literally call it an icon so I know what it is on the tree view. And then I will explain what that icon is used for example. So I have some erase validations, check validations, which essentially are, here's one of them, which is an eraser icon. That is my erase functionality. Once I actually highlight this, it will, oops. So when I highlight this, I have up here different things that I can do. So if I click on that, which would be an on select operation, I can tell it to do something. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm setting a variable called show validation, and I'm setting it to false. So that means that my show validation will eliminate the data validation things that I have on the screen, for example. What that looks like is if I click Alt, if I tap on this here, this just basically gives me my coordinates. But if I actually go into visibility, which is another attribute that I can select, you can see here in my visibility that I have I'm calling my show validation variable. So at this point, I'm controlling the visibility of that text box based upon another button or an icon. So a lot of it is propagated that way, and it can get extremely complicated because you're doing a lot of different maneuvers when you're doing complex apps. What I like to do is I like to do a lot of variables. That's usually the key because variables, you can utilize them to do different things, you know, basically like code reuse. I don't want to attribute it to a function because coming from a DBA background, functions are bad. Obviously, if you were in the first keynote, you seen Bob Ward in 2019, they actually made improvements in how functions run. So I guess I'm okay to use that comparison now. But, you know, I like to use a lot of variables so I can call them throughout. Now, there's different kinds of variables. There's a variable called update context. Update context is a local variable, which, let me actually show you what that looks like. So on my screen visible, when my screen renders, you can see here that I have an update contents. What I'm doing here is I'm saying my context is a local variable for my toggle. My toggle is this right here. So it's an on and off switch. And essentially what I'm doing is when my screen renders and it becomes visible, it's setting it to automatically use my location. So again, it's a big path of how you're orchestrating, different functionality. Ultimately, when that's set to true, then my off switch here turns to on. When that turns to on, what that's doing, and just so I can show it here, when it's turned to on, it will propagate the values of my current location to this text box. So you can see here that I'm calling my toggle GPS and I'm doing an if function to basically say if it's a value, meaning that if it's true, turned on, then what I'm doing is I'm calling location sorry, location.latitude and location.longitude. So those are built-in functions that will get the latitude and longitude coordinates. I've also written those to variables into other text boxes that I can use later on as well. I mean, what I wanted to do in this presentation initially, when I thought about doing it, is I wanted to actually do an interactive session of building the app from scratch and have people who had laptops could do it along with me. But there's so much logic within it. I could probably do a pre-con on it to be to be honest. So I figured in order to get the depth of knowledge, I would rather, dive into the more specifics and really break down the code than to try to build it all from scratch, because we only have an hour or so to do that. So I know the biggest question here is how is the map built? So I want to get into the map. So again, the map I'm calling dev.virtualearth.net, which is the API, the base API, and then I'm calling the REST v1 is the advanced API that I'm going to, and then everything else is basically a header or a query value that you pass in. As you can see, I'm calling a lot of variables and a lot of other items that are on my screen to build the whole entire construct of the map and what it renders. So for example, my whole entire dev my virtualearth.net, it needs other parameters. It needs a waypoint. It needs to know if I'm looking at a road, if I want to look at an aerial view, if I want to look at, if I want to have a zoom to be able to zoom in and out. So like I showed you on the top of the Space Needle, I'm building all of that here. So essentially, when I click on this, you can see a lot of different things are highlighted because those are different items that are within my design surface here. Any questions before I move on?
I have a question about the API. Where your key?
Yep.
Where's your key stored? Because I can see a text, so if you store it somewhere, yes.
Yep. You beat me to it. So here I have a text Bing Maps key, which is a text box. What I did is I have a configuration screen. So in my configuration screen, yep. So if you look at this, that's the text Bing Maps key. Again, to my point is I like to name everything conventional that makes sense to me, because when you start dragging buttons and input boxes and different things, it generically will assign like text input 1, button 2. It starts to get tedious to understand what everything means. So what I've done is I've created, code reusability by understanding the definitions and the descriptions of what I'm actually using and where I'm using those. To answer your first question, where I got my API key was if I go into Bing Maps here, or I'm sorry, if I go into the Bing portal, you have to sign up for an account. You can sign up with a regular email, etc., and it will generate a key for you, which is like a unique identifier. So right here, I can actually show my key. Don't steal my key. No, I'm just joking. So here's my key here, just to highlight it so I can show you where I used it in the Power App. So going back to the Power App here, you can see here it's the same key. So this is just by default, so I can use this key, so I don't have to hard code this key in like 5 different places, because I'm using 2 different maps for locations. So I put it in one place so I can reference it later. So that's why in the map you can see it says text. It's calling the name of the text box.
May I ask another question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Because
So here, let me go back into it. There is a function called location.latitude and location.longitude. So So I have text input zoom location map, which is another text box. I have that text box hidden, which is this. It's also here as well. If you can see right here, that text box literally grabs my location.latitude functionality, and the other text box that's on the left-hand side of that grabs my longitude. So I'm grabbing that with a simple function, and that's because I have location services enabled. Additionally, if you are going to rebuild this, I have all of the code in different slides. So if you want to rebuild it, feel free. It should be in the slide deck. Additionally, from the browser, you have to enable location. So every browser is different. I work out of Chrome, but if you go into settings and then privacy and security, you can basically tell it to prompt you to allow the website to utilize the location services. And so from that standpoint, when I ended up calling location.latitude, location.longitude, it knew that it was trying to call out to my location services on my computer, and it asked my permission to allow it to be used. Once I clicked OK, it added the URLs for the allow here. That's where you see the PowerApps down here. Yeah, question?
So you have like all these variables, you're storing them in your text box. Are you able to just store it to a variable so you can
Yes.
just show it on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. The problem though is when you, yes, that was I was going to say. So you can store them in variables. The problem is that in order to view it, you have to store it in something that has a visibility. So it has to be a text box or text input or something like that. So I'm just calling the values from that. You can choose to design it different ways. Any other questions before I move on? Sure.
Do you have a sense of how many times it calls back to the API? Can you track that?
Every time so you can, but you can and you can't. I don't know how many times it's calling the location services, because location services is on its own. It just finds your location. I'm assuming that it's going out every couple of seconds to try to render where you're actually at or where the device is actually at. But as far as the behind the scenes of what that interval is, I don't know. There's one other component that I want to show before I get back into the slide deck. And a lot of what I talked about of the benefit of using PowerApps outside of like Google Maps, for example, for something like this from a business use case is interacting with the database. So one of the things that I've developed in this was, and the reason why I actually have a show for my validation and a delete. So in my app, when a user's using it, they'll look at the screen as shown here. So that's what they'll see. But my validation, if I click this little wrench here, that's where it comes up with some other things that are listed. I have a timer here. This timer is how I interact with my database. So I can choose to have my timer count down or count up, and I can choose for it to actually perform an action on start or on end. So for me, what I'm doing is I'm calling a patch function. And if you get into PowerApps here in the future in development and you're trying to write to a database, the patch function will be your friend, because the patch function is like you can use it to do inserts and updates. So whatever type of functionality or interaction you want to have with your database from a user input standpoint will require the patch function. What I'm doing is if I click on this, I actually, this is in milliseconds, so my duration is actually every 10 seconds I'm writing my location coordinates to a database. So I'll show you how that works. As I mentioned, once you highlight a specific object on your screen, you can go up and choose what you want to actually control or create an expression for. So here's my duration, which is just a hard-coded value. I can change this to whatever I want. But I also have an on-timer end and an on-timer start. So on my end, it's a countdown. Here is where I'm calling a patch function. I've created a data source in my PowerApps to call an Azure SQL Database table. So it's called location services, and then I'm specifying defaults, and then I'm basically building a JSON string to insert that using the patch function. So whatever interval I have my timer set to, if it's right now it's every 10 seconds, every 10 seconds it will write an insert of my current location. So that's how, if I were a manager and I'm on the back end scene of, the office, and I have distributed delivery drivers or whatever I'm using it for, I can have a Power BI report. I can have, I can query the database directly to actually look at the location of every 10 seconds of every person, right? So if I wanted to plot that on a map for a report of Power BI, I can even take Power Apps further, and I can embed Power BI in Power Apps. But if I just wanted a dashboard of some sort to see all of my drivers and where they're at, that's how I would be able to track them. Let me show you that really quickly. So here's my Azure SQL database here, and I just literally have a table called location services. Here is my live demo from earlier that I did, and you can see all of the many times it is writing my coordinates in that database every 10 seconds. This was the convention center. I did an experiment earlier to see if this actually worked live in real time. And I went to a breakfast place that I go to every year that I come here, and I set my location, my input location, to the address of the convention center. And I walked with my phone and recorded a video and watched the map update, and it was writing these location coordinates to the database every 10 seconds. So again, I'm associating an identity column, which is this location ID. So the other thing that you can, if you were to scale or expand on this, you could create a user ID for each user that's using your app. So if you had 10 delivery drivers, you might have, they each will have their own unique ID that you can write to a database. It may even have an image or a picture of them, for example, right? From that standpoint, you can actually track, where that specific driver is and know their picture. One of the additional things that I've incorporated into this is Microsoft Flow, which I'm going to get into next. And what I wanted to do to make this even smarter, as I mentioned, is I wanted to, when I get within a certain radius of my delivery driver making a delivery, I wanted to send a notification to the customer. So I'm going to go into that portion next.
Would those queue up if you don't have internet access? They can't access the database?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I can look into that though. So the question was, if your internet access is not working, will they queue up? I don't know specifically, but I have set a notification, because if you think about logistically, and this is where you can really get into complexity of a Power App, is I set mine to send a email notification or a text message to my recipient when my driver is within 15 minutes. So if within that 15 minutes, if to the gentleman in the back, to his point, how often is it checking my location services and rendering how close I am? So when I get to 15 minutes, if my flow fires off to send that notification to my customer that says I'm within 15 minutes, what stops it from saying, okay, I'm now 14 minutes away? It's going to fire another, it's going to keep firing over and over and over. You're going to end up flooding your customer with you're 15 minutes away until you actually arrive or shut it off. So the other thing that I have, and I'll show this when I get to the demo portion, is I have a notification variable that I turn on and off based upon if it's already fired for the address that's inserted. So again, getting extremely complicated with that logic, but that's how I was able to control how often I'm actually sending that. Sure. Another question?
About the database, so you are using an Azure database. So you need a gateway or you don't need it?
No, this is an Azure SQL database, so it's not on-prem. It's hosted in Azure, so I don't need a gateway.
Only standard access to the data.
Right, exactly. So the question was, do you need a gateway in order to get to the database? This is an Azure SQL database, so it's in Azure or Azure, however you pronounce it, but it does not need a gateway because it's already hosted in Azure.
Can it write through a gateway to on-prem?
Yes, it can do that. So I don't expect to go over every single piece of logic that's in here, so I have this slide as a reference for those who have downloaded the slide or once I post it, repost it, because there were some changes here. This is just a code recap of all of the different pieces of logic that are in the Power App screens. So you can reference this if you want to rebuild this app, for example. This is just in case I ran into demo issues, which I actually did, but fortunately I was able to get into the design interface on the desktop without going through the phone. But this was just, again, a code recap to show the actual elongated string that's built to call the API. And then obviously some just images here to show you the capabilities of the different aerial coverages that you can provide. Here's the different map. So this is a different map call that actually, calls routes instead of just an imagery of, current location. So this actually, to the gentleman here in the front, the point of what kind of map are you supplying that allows you to zoom or allows it to scale automatically. So Flow, and as I mentioned now, Power Automation, what is it used for? Who in here, by show of hands, is a DBA, or you work with SQL Server on the back end and actually schedule SQL agent jobs? That's about 3/4 of the room. So this is kind of, there's limitations with SQL agent jobs. Obviously, you can run it on a schedule, or you have to call like a stored procedure that calls your like job ID to execute it, to do something. Flow is an orchestration tool that is simple UI that allows you either by template-based actions, where they have templates that say if you need to do a certain thing, it tells you what components already that you need to utilize or configure to do that, or you can start blank and kind of drag and drop your own and configure them. But it's a process flow or orchestration that allows you to automate in different ways. So like a SQL agent job, it can run on a schedule that's specific to a time or date, but it can also be triggered by other events. So it can be triggered by a button that's clicked from PowerApps, for example. Or it could, on my timer end, I'm actually checking logic and then basically executing a flow. So there's tight, seamless integration between Power Apps and Flow, or Power Automation, and I think that's why they ended up rebranding it to Power Automation, because most of the usability of it is coming from the Power Platform when it comes to utilization of the other Power pieces, Power BI and Power Apps. I mean, we actually used at RDX, we actually used Flow a while ago for change management. So we had flows that would send out, that had to be approved, et cetera. We went through a change management board. The prices of Flow are, you can do a plan, which is based upon users, or it's based upon, unlimited capacity, its own capacity. So when you think about a flow, depending on how you're using it, it can be executed thousands of times, depending on, what kind of functionality you've wrapped into it. So there, if you have a bunch of different flows, it may get costly doing $15, per month for, for per user, because it's a per user base, right? So if you have a flow, if you have 20 flows and I have 20 flows, then, we're being charged $15 a piece to use those flows. But if I have, roughly doing the math, $500 and $15 a month. If I have more than 30 something users, then I'm going to be paying, if I do the per user plan, I'm going to be paying a lot more than $500 a month. So it really depends on the use case and how your business is orchestrated, or how many people are allowed to create flows or are using flows. So if you have 200 people in your workspace and they all need to be able to run flows for some reason, you probably want to go with the $500 a month and not $15 per every 200 people, or every person for times 200.
Is this to design a flow, or every time somebody clicks a button on your app?
Create. This is the create. Yep. So here's the different templates that they provide you that actually, well, to your point, I'm sorry, sir, let me clarify that a little bit. So the question was, is it to create a flow, or if it is to just by clicking on a button to run it. It's kind of the same thing because it's per user. So if you're giving a user access to run like PowerApps, for example, then they will run the flow as themselves, if that makes sense. They will need a flow logic to do that, like a flow account, if that makes sense.
So somebody using your app would have to have a PowerApps license and a Flow license? to use
Yes,
your app?
yes.
So if you had an app with no flows, it would, you would,
Right. And I'll double check on that just to make sure I'm saying that accurately. But that's the way that I'm thinking it works. But it may or may not. But I'll double check on that to make sure. So here's some templates that they actually, you can actually start flow and you can actually start and create a flow from a template. So a template, as I mentioned, is, you can get today's weather, or you can send an Office 365 email. And it actually, once you create it from the template, it gives you the different objects laid out already, and you just configure those. But you can also create them from scratch, which is what I did. So I'll go into flow. So when you go into Flow, I had to sign in as well. So it's all the same account. So it's an Office 365 account, but you can choose, you assign plans to those accounts. So I need to check for that sake if I assign if I have a Power App and you're in my organization and you're using my Power App, if you also need a Flow license. I'm not 100% sure. But from Flow, if I go into my flows here, oops, sorry. There we go. So I went into my flows here on the ribbon. So I have send an email. Now, initially what I wanted to do is I wanted to send a text message. But by default, in order to send a text message in Flow, it has to call another service called Twilio. Twilio, you either pay for a number of sends or a number of interactions for a SMS message, or you can pay per SMS message. So I tried to find a workaround. And usually, this is kind of old school, I guess, but you can actually send a text message from email if you type in the phone number at, like if you're on Verizon, like I am, like vtext.com, and it sends an email, but it will send it alert to your phone. So that's what I've configured to do a simulation of sending a text message from a flow without going through Twilio and having to pay for the additional service.
so I have a question about notifications.
Yes, sir.
PowerApps have the ability to use notifications on a mobile device,
Yes.
like, on your lock screen or dashboard, or pop-up, that kind of thing?
So
Push notifications. Will it do that to the local device?
yeah, so you have to have the Flow app in order to do that. And from the change management standpoint of what we use at RDX, we would get notifications of a new flow that was created that needed to go through the change control board that you can approve right from the app. But you do need the Flow app on your phone. So if you have it installed on your phone, the Flow app, you will get the notification because you're logging in with an Office 365 account. So within here, you can see like my various runs here. So you can see that this triggered 5 hours ago. Let me actually get into the edit screen so I can show you. It's very, very simple how I created this. So essentially it's being triggered from my Power App. So there's nothing to actually configure here. This just basically from my Power App, I was able to make a connection to Flow, and then it generated the flow for me, and then just created this that it's being orchestrated from Power Apps. From here, I was able to bring in a connection to Gmail. From Gmail, it was extremely simple. And don't steal my phone number, but this is my phone number, and I just have a simple body in there that says your delivery will arrive within 15 minutes. So to show you how that's configured from the Power App specifically is, as I mentioned, on my second screen here. Oops. I have two timers. On my first screen, I had one timer. That timer was writing to the location services database. My other timer is what generates my flow. So if I click on, so people in the back can see my timer to the right here, and you can also see I have a notification as well that says 0. That means a notification has not been sent. As I was mentioning earlier to the gentleman to the right, right of me, is, how can I control it from not sending messages over and over again with them, because obviously when I'm within 15 minutes, my app's still going to continue to run and check how close I am. So it will set that flag to a 1 and then check that every time it needs to see if it needs to run a flow. So that's another way to cut down how many flows you actually are generating as well, because I'm controlling how often I'm calling it. So in that timer on timer end, again, I'm calling some text box values, and I'm basically saying, now I've changed this to 5 minutes because I was going to actually demo this to show you how it works and how it generates to my screen. But I'm having issues, running that flow from here. But I will show you from this, and then hopefully I'll be able to. Maybe I'll turn my volume on so you can hear that the text message came through, or I can reconnect and show that. But what I'm essentially doing is just an if statement, and I'm basically saying if the value of my text input travel time is less than 5 minutes. Now I know I had it configured to do 15 minutes, but I can change that to 5 or however often you can change it to whatever you need to. I'm saying if it's less than 5, which that is this time traveled right here. Obviously, I'm nowhere close to 5 because the last address that I put in was across the entire country, so it will never trigger that. I'm also looking to make sure that my notification is set to 0, so that will keep me from sending out multiple notifications to the same customer. And then at that point, it's extremely simple. All I'm doing is calling the calling the flow, which is the PowerApps send mail, and it's a send, and then I'm basically setting the notification to 1. So that after it runs that, then it will set my notification to 1 to make sure it doesn't send it again within that time interval.
So to reset it, would you hit your eraser to get it back to 0?
No, the eraser is just to toggle my show of my validation on and off. So for example, that's just so you can show how I've configured my timers and my location services. It doesn't have anything to do with the functionality of the app itself.
How would you reset your 1 back to 0?
So,
Would you just do a new route?
nope, it's right here. All you do is write a set function, and you call the variable, which is notification, and then you set it to a value, which is 1.
So when would you reset it? Like, so you're.
It's in an if statement. So so the question is, when would you reset it? You would reset it.
If you route, because you're going to a new customer, are they going to knock?
Okay. So the question is, if you've typed in a second location, like you're going to okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So the question from the lady to the left of me and the gentleman to the right of me here is, how do you reset it by going to if you type in a different destination? So what I have is on my button for enter a new destination, it will also set my notification to 0 here. Additionally, when I'm on my first screen, which is my main screen to enter a destination, I have a little X button. That also sets my notification to 0 because I'm clearing my text box as well. So again, this is what comes into play when you're talking about code reusability, is using variables so you can orchestrate in a lot of different places without reinventing the wheel every time. As you can see, I'm also doing within that X button, I'm doing a reset, which the name of that text box is text input location. So I'm resetting that, which will clear this value off, which essentially means I'm entering a new destination for my driver, or if I'm a driver to go to. So let's run this, and I need to try to find something that's within 5 miles, since my timer here on my second screen is less than 5. So I'm not sure what I can type in, but I'll figure it out here. So let me come back to play. Let me hide these buttons. So if I type in, yeah, that's a good point. Hilton, Seattle. See if it finds it. So I think that's about right. So let's see how far that actually is away. So if we do show route, so it's not within 5 minutes, it's within 6.5 minutes. This also it will look at traffic as well. So the map is smart enough, the calculation here is smart enough to know, excuse me, it's smart enough to know, traffic time if you choose driving directions. So a lot of times it will just calculate the distance between 2 points and it'll give you your travel time. But if you also want to factor in traffic information, now I don't know where the maps get the traffic information because it's always updating to show you it will turn red where you're coming to a slowdown. I don't know where that comes from, but it's factoring in that type of information.
That route's walk, you can switch to car, would be one of those.
I'm not sure because it's kind of finicky sometimes.
Seattle.
Yeah, yeah, it yeah, it depends. So let me
Lulay,
I'm sorry, what was that? OU. So let's see. Show route. Nope, 6.8. Actually, I think it's sending me a notification. Yeah, I am in the Sheraton. I don't know why I didn't think of that. Sheraton, Seattle. Actually, let me make sure I'm resetting everything because I'm typing in a lot of addresses. Wow. So that's not right either. I don't know if it's reset. And so on the fly, let me go ahead and change this to not look at travel time. Let me actually, yeah, that's true. That's probably better to change. I'll just change the time. So I'll do 10 minutes here. Now, what I wanted to show is I'm actually going to keep my validation rules in here so I can actually show that. Change from a 0 to a 1 if it sent a notification or not. So what I'll do is go back to my main screen here. So it will count down if you see here. Let me see if I can. It'll count to 20 first. So it should send me a notification. Actually, it didn't because, yep, it changed it to a 1. So it may take a minute for it to come in. If I refresh my runs here, you can see that it did run 23 seconds ago. Actually, it may have come in. I might have missed it. Yeah, it did come in. So it came in literally a couple seconds ago. But you can see here that the flow did run. And I would show it on my phone, but I didn't want to have an issues broadcasting, and it picking up from the app. So it did run 23 seconds ago and sent that notification. So I know we're getting close to time, and I want to get to the cognitive services piece, which is the last functionality here. So some pros and cons of Flow are the pros are it interfaces well. Obviously, as you can see, it's very simple to call it from a PowerApps. It simplifies and automates tasks. So I've made my application smart in order to, if I were a delivery driver, to send a notification. I don't know how many of you have ever had the cable company call you for service or whatever and say, can you be there, between 8 a.m. to 12? And you work, so it's like they give you this big window. This would be a use case for something like that, where you could send a notification to your customer if I was that driver to say, hey, I'm this close to your residence. It's an easy design user interface, as I showed you. Additionally, if you do have, to your point, to the gentleman to my right, is it can be laggy if you have a lot of different functionality going in and out. Additionally, from that, you cannot reorder. So if I had a bunch of complex things, in that case, I only had a PowerApps and then a Gmail. If I had a bunch of other things happening and I needed to rearrange that, I would have to delete them and recreate them and then rejoin. So that's also an issue that I hope that they fix as well. And there's no expression-based conditioning, so it is what it gives you, essentially. Now, from PowerApps, I can choose to pass a variable over to it and call that from there, but it doesn't give me any kind of expression language to code myself in PowerApps. This is just, again, some recap code design type stuff in case you want to rebuild this. And then the icing on the cake is being able to make it smart enough to be able to find restaurants near you. I showed that functionality, but I want to dive into the code. But essentially what it's doing is it's using cognitive services. Cognitive services is just really an endpoint. It already has the AI and machine learning logic baked into it. So the algorithms and everything that it's using is under the hood. So it does not give you the capability to make adjustments to it or retrain it. It does it under the hood. All it's doing is you sign up for a cognitive services account, and then what it does is you choose which cognitive services solution that you want to use. If it's a Vision API, if it's a Bing Entity API, et cetera, it gives you the endpoint, and then you basically construct that into your applications. It does require a custom connector. So it's basically a REST API call, which then, has some parameters that it's fed into, and then it parses out the JSON, and then it turns into your values that come across, which would be my restaurants, the location of my restaurants, the telephone numbers, et cetera. Here's the costs that are associated with it. I know I'm running out of time here, so I want to make sure I get at least to show you some of the code behind it. The cost is per run. So the more times you run it, and there's different tier structures depending on what metadata you're actually returning. So if you're doing, a visual search, for example, it will do 30 requests per second at $3 per 1,000 transactions. So there's different mechanisms to what metadata you're actually returning and how many requests it's sending out. Obviously, it's in batches of transactions, so you would have to monitor accordingly if you're calling this from multiple places. So what that looks like is if I go into Bing, I'll refresh here. Hopefully it doesn't ask me to authenticate again. I essentially just went into the portal here and I signed up for Bing. I created a resource group, etc. And I told it what I wanted to do. It gives me my key. So this is similar to the Bing Maps key. And then it gives you the endpoint that you need to call from the PowerApps application. So the Bing entity search, this is how essentially it works from the Microsoft doc. You can actually play with it. So if I click restaurants near me, this is using a location, the latitude and longitude location that they have baked into the Microsoft site here. So you can see it gives you the location. If I click on JSON, this is the JSON that it gives me. So from a PowerApps standpoint, you actually have to create a custom connector that will, you can feed it the response of this JSON. So you essentially construct it to what query inputs you want to put into it. You take the JSON code and you drop it into your default response, and then it allows, when you call that custom connector in PowerApps, it allows you to parse the different mechanisms or different values that are coming out of these arrays and out of these string functions here. So what that looks like is if I come back here and into my route map screen, on my button, I'm essentially setting a variable called place. I'm calling my Bing entity search and I'm passing in my query of restaurants near me and the market that I'm in, the subscription key, which I showed you from the portal, and my location, latitude, longitude, and then I'm calling places.value. I'm going to a navigate, which transitions to that last screen, which gives me a gallery list of all of the different restaurants. And then I'm basically passing in the place parameter or variable that I've set up for that, which I've set based upon that call. So then how I'm getting that is in my entity search screen here. There's a gallery. The gallery is just calling that variable. So again, code reusability. It's just calling that place variable essentially. And then each item underneath my gallery it's calling the different components of that. So the telephone number, the different address locality information, a region, et cetera. And I know I'm going through this pretty fast. I have the code that's behind all of that as well. So here's that call that I just made. I just have my key actually blanked out because I don't want to get a whole bunch of charges from everyone in the room using my key. But you can generate your own key, and that's just essentially what it parses into the gallery. So really quickly, some pros and cons. It's a low learning curve. As I mentioned, you're not actually configuring any API or any algorithms behind the scenes. It's automatically baked in. It is part of Azure services. They come up with constant updates all the time, but it is limited to the machine learning models that Microsoft is exposing to you. So, you can't go into Python and make modifications to it or retrain it or train it different ways, et cetera. It's giving you what it gives you. Some scaling and enhancements, I would like to actually enhance this to do turn-by-turn directions like Google Maps, so it could actually call another cognitive services, which is a text-to-speech, and basically calculate the difference between the endpoints so it can say, when I'm close to making a turn, it could read that back to me. So that's some enhancements that I'm looking to improve on. Also some error handling. If you have an error in your Power App, it will show you as little red X that you can hover over in a design screen, but in your actual phone app, it will literally cover your entire screen with red. I cannot show that right now. I don't have the functionality, or it wasn't working on my phone, so I apologize for that. And obviously you can add additional functionality and screens to it so you can develop to your heart's content in it. Does it work in real life? It does, and I would like to show the video, but I ran out of time. Here's the references of a lot of the documentation that I use. So it talks about route maps. It talks about how to configure the API services. It talks about the Bing Maps preview connector that I was using. It's just some good language here of where I got some of the information that I was using. So I appreciate everybody coming out. Thank you.